Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, after my latest video reacting to history buffs, I had a lot of requests for me to do another one, and these tend to do pretty well. You guys seem to like them. And the number one most requested history buffs review that I was asked to take a look at is The Patriot. This is actually from 8 years ago. They've been around a while as a channel, and I have a feeling that as a Brit, he's not going to like The Patriot, as would be understandable for any British person. I'll say this up front about The Patriot. As entertainment, I think it's a really enjoyable movie. I think the casting is fantastic. I love the characters, but please don't get any sense that these are real history stories being told. They're all loosely based on real people, and in some cases they are real people. Like Benjamin Martin's loosely based on Francis Marion. Tavington is loosely based on Tarleton, but that's about it. Then you have some real characters as well, like O'Hara and of course, Cornwallis. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. As always, a link is in the description to the original content, so you can check out History Buffs without my commentary. They do this for a lot of movies. They do a great job of telling the real history behind the events that they're talking about, and then talking about what the movie did well and didn't do well. And I have a feeling he is probably going to rip into this one pretty good. So let's go ahead and dive in. Longer intro back then. Just interesting to see the pictures that are on the walls here. I think this is Nefertiti here. That's obviously Napoleon. We've got, is that Shakespeare? Genghis Khan, George Washington. We've got Henry VIII, Vlad the Impaler, Elizabeth I, Julius Caesar. Interesting. Gladiator. Zulu. We Were Soldiers. Is it Kingdom of Heaven? That's Braveheart. Waterloo. Hey, by the way, just a heads up, gonna be at the Waterloo battlefield in July. I'm gonna be there as part of an archaeological dig. Super excited about that.
Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick
really
Hodges,
long
and
intro.
I'm finally ready to have a crack at The Patriot. When it comes to badly done historical films, there are a few better examples. It's here that Hollywood's attempts to rewrite history are most obvious. Details are changed or flat out ignored. Anything that could possibly reflect badly in the United States has no appearance in this movie, because that's not its objective. It is, however, to present us a romanticized depiction of American history and to glorify American patriotism to such an extent that it patronizes the audience it is intended for.
It's literally called The Patriot, so that should give you a clue as to what the intention of this movie is.
These are some of the things I truly hate in a film, because it knowingly promotes ignorance and leaves viewers with a false impression of history. This is The Patriot.
Charleston.
So the film begins in 1776, right before the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was an uneasy time and tensions were high.
Now, I will say this. If you go to Charleston even today, a lot of the buildings look like that. I was just in Charleston a couple of months ago. It's a really cool, relatively small town, I mean, compared to a lot of big cities. And it still has a lot of its history.
Something was happening that had never been done before. The very idea of breaking away from the king and establishing a new nation was truly revolutionary, but also controversial. Not all Americans wanted independence from Great Britain, and a line had been drawn between the rebels who believed in freedom and colonials loyal to the crown. America was anything but united back then. What started out as a small revolt in Boston had quickly escalated into a civil war. Yes, I said civil war. From the Loyalist point of view, the British soldiers were legitimate government troops. In fact, many Loyalists joined the army out of the same sense of patriotism that the rebels felt for their cause.
Absolutely 100% true, especially in the Carolinas where this is set. It is very much a civil war. Some of the battles that are fought in the South, some of the important battles like Kings Mountain, that's largely fought between Americans. It's Americans on both sides. It's Loyalist militia versus American militia. And they would, some of the stuff you see here is probably overblown some, like when he locks an entire town into a church and sets it on fire and murders them all. Nothing like that happened. But there absolutely were some pretty murderous reprisals between militias on both sides. They weren't rounding up civilians and killing them, but they absolutely had no trouble hanging people from the other side's militia. In fact, I have a piece of the tree from my ancestor who was a Loyalist militia captain who was hanged in North Carolina in 1781.
Only 1/3 of Americans actually supported independence back then. But the Patriot makes very little mention of this. In fact, I think we're only introduced to one Loyalist in the whole movie, and we're made to feel a certain way about him.
Yeah,
Those
like he's a
natives of
traitor.
mine who stand against England deserve to die a traitor's death.
Just in case you didn't get it, you're supposed to hate this guy. He's the Judas, he's the traitor.
That's true.
Let's not explore his motivations, his political beliefs, or his reasons to fight his fellow countrymen.
That's a fair point. I mean, who's the traitor? I mean, it is absolutely spun that way, like he's somehow a traitor when he's really the loyalist, and you could argue that the Patriots are the traitors. Whether you agree with their cause or not, they are absolutely the ones who are rebelling against the legitimate authority.
You're supposed to dismiss him and label him as a backstabber. So anyway, how did this war start? Well, if we left it to the Patriot to explain...
If you mean by patriot, am I angry about taxation without representation? Well, yes, I am. Should the American colonies govern themselves independently? I believe they can, and they should.
And that's generally about it. For the rest of the movie, they just drone on and on about freedom. But freedom from what? Now, of course, taxation without representation was an important factor, but this only begins to scratch the surface of a much bigger picture.
Now, that's absolutely true, and there are definitely other issues at play here, and we've talked about those in some videos. But listen, the common everyday American who doesn't know the deep nuances of history from the 18th century is going to feel pretty much the same way. They're going to feel this kind of patriotic, this was about freedom from tyranny. That's pretty much the average American's view on the revolution. So it doesn't surprise me that that's what's portrayed here.
In 1763, the British had won a major victory at the end of the 7 Years' War, securing more land and wealth for their colonies. Although this left Great Britain in a position of being the world's first superpower, it wasn't a war they wanted to fight and left them in huge debt. Now, seeing how British subjects in America benefited the most out of this costly war, with more land and more resources, the government thought it was only fair that they be the ones to help with the bill. However, this would not be the case, as many Americans just refused to pay these new taxes. Surprisingly, Great Britain didn't even collect on these new taxes. They backed down time and time again until finally they had enough. The famous tax on tea was the only tax they were going to enforce, and that's when the colonists revolted. I
don't want to get too much into this because we're talking specifically about the Patriot and not about the whole history of the revolution, but it's a classic story of escalation on both sides. One side will do something the other side doesn't like, and so they escalate. And so then the other side responds to that escalation with an escalation of their own until you get to a point of no return. Absolutely, there were mistakes and escalations and bad choices on both sides.
Pressed the issue that they wanted no taxation without representation, but to the British government, they were already seen as British subjects and were therefore represented. However, I think that another factor was in play, and that was the British government regulating colonial expansion.
100% true, and I say this all the time, especially if you look at the people who are the movers and shakers in the colonies, the wealthy kind of landowners, the ones that are making a lot of these decisions about rebellion. There's a ban on expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains under the British government. There's a whole lot of land over there, and all there is some Native Americans that can be easily pushed off. I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying that's how they saw it. And the British government was keeping them from being able to expand. And that's absolutely a major motivation in all of this.
In 1763, the Royal Proclamation Line was issued that forbade settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. This angered American settlers, as coming to America and finding new land to call their own was the whole point of coming over there.
Yep.
There's a scene in the movie that contradicts this, where we see the British planning to seize new lands after the war.
That's true.
When this war is over here in the colonies, the new aristocracy will be landowners.
Tell me about Ohio. That's what he says.
Tell me about Ohio.
But Ohio wouldn't be on the agenda because the Royal Proclamation Line reserved Ohio and all lands west for Native Americans. This was issued to reconcile with the Indians for past offenses and prevent future hostilities.
Now, having said that, had the British held on to the colonies, would that have lasted forever? I highly doubt it. At some point, that expansion would have happened.
Now, I'm under no illusion that this would have been a permanent thing,
Yeah.
and Western expansion was inevitable. But having the Brits scheme about it this early on is just premature at best.
That's fair.
So with no immediate opportunity for future expansion or for American representation in Parliament, revolution escalated quickly into war.
The Battle of Camden. This is a common criticism of the movie.
The character of Benjamin Martin is loosely based on several historic figures, but in my opinion, the most relevant one is Francis Marion. Francis Marion was also known as the Swamp Fox and operated in South Carolina during the Revolutionary War. His base of operations was Snow's Island, which was located in the middle of the South Carolina swamps, not unlike how Benjamin Martin operated from the old Spanish mission. He is generally considered to be one of the fathers of modern guerrilla warfare, and his militia were brutally effective against the British. But unlike Martin, Marion was childless and did not even marry until after the war. The decision made to give Benjamin Martin's character a family was not only to allow the audience to sympathise with him, but also give him something to fight for. When his son is shot by Tavington, it provides the catalyst for him to organise a militia and fight. However, these changes don't bother me. It's this little scene that does.
By standing order of His Majesty King George, all slaves of the American colonies who fight for the crown will be granted their freedom with our victory.
Sir, we're not slaves. We work this land. Freedmen.
Oh, then you're freed men who will have the opportunity and the privilege of fighting in the king's army, aren't you?
That is by far the most disgusting thing I've ever heard in a historical movie. No wonder...
I wouldn't go so far as to say that's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard in a historical movie. But I do agree that there was a missed opportunity there. There's no reason that they couldn't have portrayed them as being slaves. I don't understand what harm there is in portraying that as being true.
Benjamin Martin's character is only loosely based on Francis Marion, because Francis Marion was a slave owner. In fact, Francis Marion's slaves ran away from his plantation to fight for the British, which says a lot about the guy. Now, just because by modern standards slavery disgusts us today, doesn't mean that we should accept a retelling of history that is afraid to approach it. I think I would give audiences the benefit of the doubt to accept the main protagonist if he was a slave owner.
I agree. He's getting a little worked up here. Calm yourself down a little bit, Nick.
Underestimate your audience. They're generally sensitive, intelligent people who respond positively to quality entertainment.
Too right, mate. And what's worse is that this scene seems to be an attempt to villainize the British by having them kidnap these black workers just to oppress these poor plantation owners.
Fair point.
That the British are simply using slaves as tools of war.
Calm down.
But
Calm
in another
down, Nick.
scene, we see the Americans do the exact same thing.
It says take notice. By order of General George Washington and the Continental Congress, all bound slaves who give minimum 1 year service in the Continental Army will be granted freedom and be paid a bounty of 5 shillings for each month of service. Did you hear that? First they're gonna free them, and then they're gonna pay them.
Only another 6 months.
What in the hell are you gonna do with freedom?
Can you see the difference here? The gentle swelling of the music and the look of hope and determination in his eyes. This has a totally different tone than the one before. Here the film is twisting the American proclamation of freedom to be noble and just, whilst the British version is the exact opposite. The truth of the matter is that when the British first declared their promise of freedom to slaves, it scared the shit out of the Americans. So when they made their offer, it was out of desperation, not out of noble sentiment. Both sides were just as cruel in how they used and manipulated African Americans for their cause. So why is the Patriot biased between one side and not the other, especially if they're both doing the same thing?
Making them to be the bad guys.
I think there's one particular moment in the film that is worth looking at. It's shortly after the scene when Benjamin Martin and his sons ambush the British convoy. His son confides to his father his own personal feelings about killing the British soldiers.
I killed those men.
You did what I told you to do. You did what you had to. There was no wrong in it.
I'm glad I killed them. I'm glad.
Now,
That is a perfectly reasonable feeling for a kid whose brother was just murdered by a British soldier. So I don't have a problem with that particular scene.
now I know it's not safe to jump to conclusions, but I just can't shake this feeling that the Patriot has a very anti-British sentiment.
I get what he's saying, and there are definitely moments where it's not so much anti-British as it is pro-American. It's making it bad guys and good guys, and obviously wasn't that. It was much more nuanced and gray than that. But that particular scene to me ain't it. That's a perfectly reasonable expression of anger toward the people he feels are responsible for the death of his brother.
Every damn one of them redcoats deserves to die.
I'm gonna kill me some redcoats.
Where else do I get the opportunity to kill a few redcoats?
Surrender! We surrender!
Perhaps a few wounded ones when you're not looking.
For the love of God, we... This is murder!
Well, Reverend, they're redcoats, and they burned it.
But that just could be...
Hey, fun fact, this Reverend right here, the actor, he's since passed away, direct descendant of Napoleon's sister. I think he's like a great-great-grandson of Napoleon Bonaparte's sister. So Napoleon's his uncle. Pretty cool stuff.
Murder!
Well, Reverend, they're redcoats, and they burned it.
But that just could be my interpretation. However, the film's objective is clear, and that is to villainize the Brits as much as possible. As antagonists, they are comically portrayed to be bloodthirsty British thugs. Every conceivable negative stereotype that's attributed to the British is amplified. Pompous, stuck-up, and arrogant are to name a few.
These rustics are so inept.
That said, the British did feel that way about the Americans, especially about their militia. So I get that. And again, I don't have a problem with it. I know what's happening here, and I would do the same thing if I were in Nick Hodges' place. When we feel like something is super biased, we come at it from our own bias and probably sometimes push back too much. I've been guilty of that in videos myself where I feel like someone's being unfair in their portrayal. So I get that he's probably overcompensating a little bit for that. 90% of what he's saying I agree with, but I feel like he's nitpicking a little too much with it. I don't have a problem with this.
Nearly takes the honor out of victory.
Nearly.
Nearly.
Now, far be it from me...
Plus, Tom Wilkinson is fantastic. He just passed away not long ago. And this guy here, this is General Charles O'Hara, who actually is the one who did the actual surrender at Yorktown, because Cornwallis was indisposed and couldn't be there. So O'Hara surrendered to Benjamin Lincoln, who was Washington's second in command at that point. O'Hara has the distinction of being the only general who surrendered both to George Washington and Napoleon Bonaparte.
suggests that the British never committed any atrocities, as in every war they were committed by both sides.
Both sides,
You only
absolutely.
need to look at the historical figure Tavington is based on, Bannister Tarleton, who built up quite a reputation amongst Patriot rebels as a butcher.
The Waxhaws.
More specifically due to his involvement in the Waxhaw Massacre in South Carolina. Now, what happened is the subject of much debate. During the heat of battle, Continental Army Colonel Buford raised a white flag calling for quarter. At some point, a musket was fired and hit Tarleton's horse, incapacitating him.
And I do believe that Colonel Buford is a relative of John Buford from the Civil War.
In a fit of rage, his loyalist cavalry, believing the call of surrender to be a trick, charged into Buford's men and cut them down, including many who still tried to surrender. Of the 400 Virginians, over 100 were killed, and this is where Tarleton's reputation as a butcher was most prevalent.
And there were other massacres like this as well. There was one committed by the Americans up north. There was one committed by the British up north at Tappan, New York, that is well known as well.
The fighting and following battles grew in ferocity on both sides, and Tarleton's quarter became a common expression for his refusal to take prisoners. He was dubbed the Bloody Band for his belief in total war, and was used by American propaganda to fuel British resentment.
And then was a member of Parliament in the years after the war. He was actually played by Kieran Hines in the movie Amazing Grace, about the striving by William Wilberforce to get rid of the slave trade and then eventually slavery itself in the British Empire.
In The Patriot, however, Tavington's cruelty and malice is turned up to 11.
Yeah.
If killing prisoners of war doesn't make you hate him, then surely killing children will.
Stupid boy.
Now, I'm sure that the
And listen, can we just take a minute and appreciate that Jason Isaacs is one of those actors who can just own any role he's in. I mean, Marshal Zhukov in The Death of Stalin, he's fantastic. He's really good as Malfoy in Harry Potter, and he was in Black Hawk Down. He's been in a lot of roles, and he always does a fantastic job.
filmmakers will insist that these are the actions of a single man, but that's not the impression left with audiences. What Tavington does reflects on how the characters and audience view the British. See, there's a difference between taking creative liberties in order to drive the plot of an historical film to simply making shit up. Which brings us to what is perhaps the most controversial part of the whole movie.
Yeah. This town has given aid to Benjamin Martin and his rebels. I wish to know his whereabouts. So, anyone who comes forward may be forgiven their treason. Very well. You had your chance.
Wait! This man gives Martin and his men supplies.
Quiet.
He brings them to Black Swamp.
He's a liar!
You
In
damn
the marsh,
fool.
by the old Spanish mission.
This man here.
Yes, sir.
The Black Swamp, you say, by the old Spanish mission. Thank you very much. Shut the doors.
But you said we'd be forgiven.
And indeed you may.
That's between you and God.
This is the moment when the Patriot can no longer claim to be based on history, because there is nothing in written records to suggest that the British ever burnt a church filled with civilians.
That's true.
If anything like this were to have happened, it would have been burnt into the memory of every American today.
But here's what I'll say. I don't know that the Patriot ever claimed to be an accurate history. It's a film. It's a fictional film set in a historical era that plays fast and loose with a lot of the facts and kind of uses stuff that was going on. Saving Private Ryan is no different. None of that really happened. It's set in a historical framework, but it's a made-up story.
Can you imagine the propaganda value this would have had for the Patriot cause back then? Take, for example, the impact of the infamous Boston Massacre, and only 5 people died there, probably making it the most unmassacry massacre in the history of massacres. So, what's this movie's reason for this massacre not being common knowledge?
The honor is found in the end, not the means. This will be forgotten.
No one forgets stuff like this. To find anything even similar, you can't even look at the American War for Independence, but at the Second World War. On June 10th, 1944, a massacre took place eerily similar to the one presented in The Patriot. In the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France, German troops came and ordered all the townsfolk to assemble. The women and children were locked in the church with explosives, whilst the SS took the men to nearby garages and barns to be shot. In total, 642 people died. One of the most horrific war crimes in history, and it somehow ends up inspiring a scene supposed to be set to the American War for Independence.
I don't think it inspired that scene. There are other examples of that. Vlad the Impaler did stuff like that. It happened in the British Isles throughout history. There are lots of examples of that kind of thing happening, even though it didn't happen in the Revolutionary War.
It just seems like this film is so aggressive with its hateful stance against
angry
the British
about
that
this.
it's not even trying to be subtle.
Calm yourself, sir.
Like this scene, for example, where in the final battle, Benjamin Martin literally stabs Tabby-T's horse with the American flag.
People did that.
You don't have to be a symbologist to figure out what that's supposed to be about. So, it's no wonder that this movie stirred up so much controversy with allegations about being anti-British. Look, if you want the Brits to be the bad guys, then have them do stuff we know they did. You can't create the largest empire in history by being nice about it. So, I'm sure there's plenty of material to work with. Maybe.
It wasn't about wanting the British to be the bad guys. It was about a very specific story in which the British were the enemy, so he made them the bad guys. He wasn't like sitting there thinking to himself, I really need to make a movie where I show the British as evil people. No, he was making a movie that was a patriotic American movie, and he made the British in that movie an over-the-top bad guy. I feel like he's just taking this a little too personally.
Have your historical epic be based on history instead of bullshit. Potential hate-mongering aside, there is one final thing that needs to be addressed with The Patriot. Now, while it's not nearly as offensive as his depiction of slavery or fictional atrocities, it's definitely worth at least thinking about. It's pretty clear that The Patriot was made to celebrate some of the best qualities America stands for today, particularly its beliefs in equality.
If we win this war, a lot of things will change.
What will change?
They call this the New World. It's not. It's the same as the old. But we'll have a chance to build a new world. A world where all men are created equal under God.
Now, here's the thing. There were absolutely Southerners who felt this way. John Laurens was one of them. John Laurens, who's been made famous again by the musical Hamilton, was a South Carolina aristocrat whose father was president of the Continental Congress. His father was a major slave owner in that place. But John Laurens wanted to raise entire battalions of black troops and wanted to emancipate them. And listen, he wasn't perfect. He was still a Southerner in the 18th century. But he was much more like this than people realize.
Equal. Sounds good.
The problem is, though, that this movie brings up American ideals today, but not back then. In 1776, the Declaration...
Yeah, but there were people who thought that. It's not saying that Heath Ledger's character represents the majority view. He obviously doesn't, but it was a view that some people held.
Independence stated what many Americans believed in and fought for. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But unfortunately, exceptions were made, and the reality didn't apply to all Americans.
That's true.
Most of the African-American rebels who fought for independence were never given the freedom they were promised.
True.
Native American Indians were systematically slaughtered to the brink of extinction, and 100...
That's a story for another day. I don't like how he worded that.
100,000 American loyalists were expelled from their country of birth, never to see it again. the true prospect of equality and civil rights would continue to be ignored well into the 20th century.
Yeah, true.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And only just recently have the promises of these great words been fully realized, this time in regards to gay rights.
And I believed that discrimination because of somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity ran counter to who we are as a people. And it's a violation of the basic tenets on which this nation was founded. I believe that gay couples deserve the same legal rights as every other couple in this country.
The real truth history tells us is that independence did not automatically result in a great America. It was rather the beginning of a work in progress, one that is still continuing today.
That's true.
My problem with the Patriot is that it's not a true representation of American history, and it's quite clear that it's not because they didn't do their research, because the battle scenes, the sets, and the costumes are extremely well done. What is wrong is when filmmakers distort and fabricate history when they find things they don't like, shaping the truth to be what they believe it should be, and by doing so, promote misconceptions and ignorance to audiences everywhere. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs.
All right, so 99% of the time I agree with the things that he says in his videos. I feel like, as I mentioned already, that this was maybe a little bit overcompensating on the pushback. I don't think anybody thinks that the Patriot is an accurate representation of history. And yes, it absolutely makes the British to be super bad and the Americans to be super good. And the reality is much more in between there. But hopefully people can understand that. But it also probably represents how a lot of Americans feel about those events. So I unfortunately probably reinforces things that people already believe to be true. So for the most part, I think he's right. I just think he got a little too angry about it, but I've been guilty of that as well, so I totally understand that. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and if you have another History Buffs video or some other video that you'd like to recommend to me, let me know in the comment section, and we'll take a look at that. Thanks for watching.